Welcome to the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and share their inspiring stories. Now, let's get started with the show.
Matthew Connor here, host of the Cyber Business Podcast. Today, we are joined by the CIO of Heartland Financial, aka HTLF, Brad Enneking. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matthew. Just really happy to be here. Can't wait to dive in and talk about whatever comes up.
I can't either. This is going to be great. Before we get too far in, though, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. Do you know if a hacker's in your system? Most people and most companies don't until it's too late and a hacker's already done damage. A hacker's job is to bypass your security, so companies need a way of knowing when someone's gotten past theirs. That's where CyberLink's intrusion detection comes in. With our 24/7 Security Operations Center, we use a combination of AI and cybersecurity technicians to see when a hacker successfully bypassed your security. So if a bad guy gets past your security, we'll know right away and be able to kick them out. Find out more at cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. And now back to our show. All right, Brad, for those who are not familiar, can you tell us about HTLF and your role there as CIO?
Sure. HTLF is a $20 billion regional bank. We have locations in the Midwest, South, and the Southwest. We are a conglomeration of 36 different banks that we've purchased over the last 20 years. Recently consolidated all of them down into 11 different brands across 11 different states, and then recently went through a charter consolidation. So now we are a single operating company with again, those 11 different brands. My role as CIO, I manage the infrastructure, data, applications, digital, and parts of security. So basically anything that has to do with technology comes through my team in some form or fashion.
I love it. Well, only $20 billion. That doesn't seem like a very large bank. That's fantastic. And then but I'm struck by the fact that it's basically 11 different brands that you guys have kind of brought together over 20 years, bringing all those together under one roof. As CIO, that must have been a lot of fun for you. So, can you kind of walk us through that? I mean, heck, people, even when you have a relatively small company buying another small company and bringing them together, it's challenging, to say the least, on an IT level, bringing those together, making things smooth. Now you're talking about financial services with billions of dollars at stake and, a lot of different pieces, that couldn't have been easy, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been with the organization for about 4 years, so I wasn't part of all of those. But what I was able to do is build on the progress that had been made in the past. And the advice that I'll share is that we did a great job consolidating all of the technology for every purchase that we had. I've been part of too many M&As where they're that leave the technology, leave everything with the acquired company, and that you pay the price for that long term. So historically, we did a great job consolidating all of the technology, and then in the last few that I was part of, we continued that trend, continued to consolidate the technology, and the one gap that we had was we didn't consolidate the processes. So everybody's on the same technology, but they're still doing their own processes their own way. And so when we recently did our consolidation, where we consolidated all of our charters, technology was the easy part. The hard part was all of the process changes, the change management throughout all of the organizations to standardize on a single process to open an account or, open a loan or, anything along those lines. We had 11 different brands, but we had 100 different ways to do it. So we got that all down to one. So that was the exciting part of the journey. I got to clean up the history of those 36 acquisitions.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because that sort of that I don't, getting the policies, procedures, all of that, and kind of training that. It's one thing to say, hey, this is our policy, this is our procedure, whether it's policy, procedure. And I think coming from the IT side, or on, on the operations side of things, just having those things set and then kind of rolling those out and educating everybody about it is a challenge. And I think that bleeds over really, very, very heavily into kind of that employee training, because you basically you're training these policies and procedures. And now the same happens with that IT, security, right? You've got policies and procedures when it comes to what users should and shouldn't be doing, and then the training of it. So I think this is always really interesting because I find they're very different in terms of how people roll this out. For you guys, having kind of consolidated that, what was the approach? Was it just, from Mount Olympus decreed down and everybody just did it because it came from the top, or how did that work for you guys?
Well, it really had to be a combination of both to be successful. The first thing was getting buy-in of the senior leadership of our executive team. Not so much, although importantly, so we could roll it out, do the communication, and have their support. But I think most importantly, so we could do the follow up on the back end. We could establish accountability on the back end. And I think with any policy, with any procedure, with any change management, you can train all you want, but unless you have metrics on the back end, unless you have accountability, unless you are validating that people are actually doing what you expect them to do and following the policy and the procedure, then there's hardly any value. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times, and I'm sure anybody who's listening is thinking of examples that they have where they rolled something out. It was great. It was cool. It was absolutely something we should do, or something we were mandated to do or regulated to do, and it just didn't go well. And I think it's because you have to have all of those pieces. You have to get executive buy-in on the front end. You have to make sure the people who are experiencing the change understand the why. I mean, and that's such a critical foundational piece, is understand the why of what we're doing, and then execute the training. But then you still need the follow up. You still need the accountability, because the first time, the first time somebody doesn't do it, they wait for lightning to strike, and if it doesn't, well, then guess what? It just gets next time to not do it, right? To not follow the policy, or not do it the new way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Now, you mentioned the kind of getting the leadership and executive buy-in, and I think that's such an important thing, because I think a lot of IT management kind of, I don't want to say they struggle with it, but I think it's a challenge. That's just an industry challenge for a lot of CIOs and I just say IT management, I think, as a whole. And maybe it's because of how we tend to come up through IT. It tends to be more on the IT side than on the management side a lot of times. People generally don't come in, up at the top of as the CIO. You don't go from, they don't generally bring a consultant who's an IT consultant in as the CIO. They tend to be people who've progressed in IT and then progressed in IT management, and now they're at the head. And I think my theory, and I'm getting to a question here, I think that it may be because we're so technically oriented, and I think that's what draws a lot of us to IT in the first place, is we love it, right? We just love the technology and everything. And then you get to a point where you're like, you start enjoying the management portion of it, or you get some success and they want you to be the manager, and then you just kind of, career progression, move up from there. So I think that all leads to IT managers tending to be more focused on the cool tech than on the management and communication portion, which I think tends to be a big challenge. So I like to ask, we have a lot of really great successful CIOs who come on, and they tend to have really great kind of tips and ideas on how to better communicate with the C-suite. And so I'd like to, that's a long intro to the question, but for you, are there any tips and tricks and ideas that you have with communicating to the C-suite that you can share?
Well, it's really interesting, as an expert in any field, or as somebody who's really knowledgeable in any field, you really start to get you really start to take your knowledge for granted, and it's so inherent in how you think and how you speak that sometimes you really have to be cognizant and aware of what you sound like, and and how you're communicating. So what I always like to think about is think about any other expert that you talk to. If you talk to doctors, if you talk to lawyers, if you talk to, somebody who is knowledgeable in a space that you aren't. I think most people have been to the doctor and they don't use all of the technical terms for your bones and your muscles, and so they have a different way of talking that allows you, as somebody who isn't a medical expert, to understand what they're saying. And they talk a lot about implications. So if we do this, then this will likely be the outcome. Or you have this condition, and so here are potential treatments. So I often think about how doctors communicate when I think about how to communicate with somebody who's non-technical, in particular the C-suite. So what do they really, what do they really care about? They really care about understanding, is there an issue, and what are we going to do to solve it? But why is it an issue? Why should I care? And so really thinking about how to tell that story, how to relate the information to your audience, is something that, especially as you move up in IT, is something that you really need to think about, you really need to work on, and you really need to be focused on understanding the business. I think gone are the days when a CIO could, sit behind a locked door. I remember my first job, we as technology sat behind a locked door, and it was very symbolic more than anything else. And so as you move up, you need to understand the business more and more. And that is absolutely essential for a CIO. So as I think about, foundational skills that you should develop, understanding the business. The other thing I absolutely love is the use of analogies. So I have a list of analogies that I use. I think most IT people are familiar with the house analogy. You need to have a foundation. You build the rooms, you put paint on the walls. I think we've all used that analogy to a certain extent. And that I have found is one of the best ways to be able to relate, to be able to bridge that gap between my expertise and my terminology and somebody who's non-technical and their understanding of the world. Is just, I think it's a really powerful way to bridge that gap.
I completely agree. I mean, I think analogies are perhaps the easiest, best way to get the non-technical person to understand what might be a very complicated thing. I mean, and that may be the challenge for people, is finding, the right analogy, because sometimes there's usually not a perfect analogy, but in the end of the day, if you don't worry too much about all the details being there, it's just getting the big idea across. As long as they get the gist of it, oh, okay, the house, the security system, the whatever it is. Oh yeah, I get it. Okay, yeah, perfect, got it. I know it. Nobody expects the perfect analogy to work, on all the details, and I think that trips a lot of people up. They're like, especially our inner geek starts tearing it apart with how it doesn't quite add up, and there's this part that's wrong. It's like, okay, yeah, that's great. Well, let me ask you. So, in talking to the C-suite and using analogies, I also think that storytelling is one of those things that's kind of right up there, and it goes kind of side by side with analogies. But do you find that when you're trying to convey an idea, are you kind of the natural storyteller who tells a story, or are you more the kind of the technical, let's say, motivator? You're motivated by the technical things, and you motivate people that way. What would you say is your style when it comes to kind of talking with the C-suite and getting them on board with a technical issue?
I would say continually, excuse me, continually evolving, because I would say the hardest thing I ever did in my career was go from developer to my first manager role. Because when you're a developer, your hands on the keyboard, you're producing something, you can see the results at the end of the day. And when you move into management, especially when you first move into management, that's not nearly as obvious. You get to the end of the day and you typically say, I was busy all day. I worked all day, but what did I do?
What did I
Right?
do? Yeah.
What did I produce? And so it
Yep.
took me a while to get into that. And I remember my first senior management role, I got a lot of constructive feedback because I was still very technical. In fact, a manager of mine, and I've never forgotten this analogy, and I use it with my folks all the time. I asked you what time it is, and you told me how to build a watch. And that always gives me pause because, if you think about that, that's so apt for most technology people. So it's been a journey. It's been continual growth. And I will say that my current primary focus in my career is really on storytelling, is really on bridging that gap, understanding the business, but being able to relate. I am naturally not the best business storyteller. If I'm talking to tech people, I can talk all day long. So that is something that I'm working on. But what I found is, and what I've been successful at, is partnering with somebody from the business who's most aligned with whatever it is that we're doing. So I'll give you a quick example. We recently completely rebuilt our data warehouse and wanted to implement a single source of truth, wanted to wrap data governance around it. So really we're rebuilding it from the ground up. And one of the most interested stakeholders was our CFO. And he wanted, obviously, accurate financial reporting because it was something that we had struggled with in the past. So aligning with him and making sure we were on the same page. He was the storyteller in this case, and he was a very effective storyteller, and his why was very powerful because it was about accurate financials, which every company needs, accurate forecasting, which obviously helped us make decisions going forward into the future. So, yeah, I mean, I think that that's really a powerful element as well. So if you're not a great storyteller, or if you're working on becoming a good storyteller, align with somebody who is, or align with somebody who's close to what it is that you're trying to do, and have them help you with that. Very, very powerful. It takes a village, kind of thing.
One of the things I notice is that you focus a lot on the why, which I think is just so important in getting, well, anything, resolving an issue, communicating, with somebody, trying to get the buy-in from others on something, focusing on the why. I think especially in management, all too often people get caught up on the how, the who, the what. Those are
Yes.
all kind of irrelevant. At the end of the day, the mission is about, accomplishing it, and to get people to do it. It's why are we doing this? The only reason it's funny. My wife recently, literally like 2 days ago, signed us up for my first marathon, her like 100th. And she's like, let's do it. And I'm like, wait, I need a why. Very quickly, I need a why that I'm going to go do this. Cause
Right.
I used to run a bit, but now I'm, sore after running a mile and a half. So I need my why so that I can get to the 26 miles next year when it's time. And so it's
Right.
that why that's going to carry me through this. And so I like hearing that you talk about this why so often. Was there a kind of a story as to how you got there to the why, or is this just kind of naturally you focus on the why because that's what's important, and that's how people are going to get there?
Well, it's a couple of different things. It was something that motivated me more than anything else throughout my career, and it took me a while to realize that, because if a dictate came down from on high that we're going to go in this direction and we're going to do this, um, I found myself rarely engaged with it if that was the extent of the communication. But over time, it became pretty clear that if I understood how it was impacting the company, or how this fit into the company's goals, or in my relationship goals, in your example, it allowed me to become much more engaged. And then over time, I also found that the more I explained why to the folks that I was working with, the folks that were on my team, the more engaged they were. And the coolest thing is that the more ideas they came up with, because they're like, well, hey, you know what? If we're trying to do this, why don't we do it this way? And they often come up with way better ideas than I do. So I love that, and so going back to what I was saying before about the hardest thing transitioning to management was not having something tangible. That is my tangible now. When the folks that I work with go beyond what I expected of them, or maybe more importantly, what they expected of themselves, but go beyond what I would have thought of or what I'm capable of. I mean, that's the best feeling in the world. So, so that sort of developed over time, but I have become a little bit of a Simon Sinek follower. So I don't know if you know Simon or if you've ever heard of his stuff, when he talks about the golden circle and when he talks about Apple. And his story about Samuel Pierpont Langley is one of my favorite ones. And then I recently found an old video from, I don't know, 86 or 87 of Steve Jobs. It's about 5 minutes long, but it's his speech when he comes back to Apple, where he's talking about why they do what they do. And it's brilliant. And it's so inspiring. And he's just standing up there in short cargo shorts and a t-shirt. And he's just talking about how passionate he is about this. And it's really the fundamental of not that they make computers or that they make, any other electronics. It's nothing to do with that. Oh, it was the advent of their Think Different ad campaign. Brilliant. So I look for things like that to really reinforce and give me, better capability to be able to communicate that, but also to be able to come up with it, especially as we're thinking about strategy and what we want to do as an organization and what we want to do as a technology organization. Is that's so critical. So how do we, what is the why? And so I know, my boss and my peers, and quite frankly, all of my teams are very annoyed with me always asking why. So my boss asks me to do something and I'll say, why? And it's a little more nuanced than that, but you get the idea. And so it's really critical, I think, especially for me, personally, and for my team to understand why. So it's very fundamental to how I operate.
Well, I think that is kind of fundamental to good leadership, right? The good leadership, it inspires the followership and it inspires people to buy in. And as you said, when they come up with even better things, they understand the mission because you've explained why, and that's why it's so important. And now they're able to further the mission and improve the mission and the outcome and the success. And I think that that's so paramount and fundamental to good leadership, that and it's often overlooked. People get it twisted and they think that leadership is about strong leadership and being in control and dominating the controlling everybody, and it's just not. It is about inspiring, and it starts with why. And once people understand that, why they're at their job, why they're doing these things, that's what it's all about. And so I think that leadership, I think, kind of bleeds over into mentorship. And I think I wanted to ask you about, when it comes to mentoring all of your teams and whatnot, do you have any sort of particular tips, tricks, things that you like to do when it comes to mentoring?
Well, I would say the biggest single outcome that I target is empowerment. And so that's pretty broad. But when somebody moves into a role on my team, or if I take on a team where there's leadership, one of the first things I say is, this is your space. You own it, and you need to run it. And here is what I need from you. So, periodic updates, certain, especially initially, if there are any major decisions that need to be made. Let's talk about it before you do that. But I really want to make sure that they understand that it's their space. And most of the people I've worked with, they struggle a little bit to understand what that means. And they are very worried about getting in trouble or going too far. And and that, I think that's a good instinct, right, to a certain extent. So it takes time to develop that relationship and where my boundaries are and where their boundaries are, and so we need to continue to work with that. But the first thing is they own their area, they own their space, and so they need to be empowered to do that. And if they do step outside, or if they do overstep, or if they do go into a different direction that maybe doesn't align with the strategy, it's rarely about anything punitive. I mean, depending on what it is, right? There's that 1% where you're like, what the hell were you thinking, kind of thing. But the rest of it's just an opportunity for a conversation. So once they realize that if they make a decision and they're not immediately going to get punished for it, then they start to build that trust. They start to be more engaged. They start to expand that horizon. So it's about giving them the capability to freely run their department, obviously within some reasonable guidelines. But I think once people get to that point, again, they really start to grow. They really start to engage. They really start to come up with great ideas. And I've gotten to the point in my current role where I rarely, if we need to implement a new metric, as an example, I will rarely say, here's a new metric, this is what we need to do. I will say, hey, I'm thinking about measuring this. What do you guys think? And I'll get 5 better ideas than I would have come up with. But then there's also ownership and empowerment on the team side. So then when we move forward with it, there's much more engagement and adoption in that.
Yeah, I think that kind of giving people ownership of their domain, I think it is just such a great thing. And I think a lot of managers, whether it's new or old, struggle with that. And it's always odd to me, because if you kind of micromanage, you're not going to get the most out of them. They're not going to feel empowered to excel. They don't need to understand the mission. They just need to do what you said and not get in trouble. And that doesn't inspire people to, like, I can't wait to get into work today and not piss Brad off and just do what I'm supposed to do. Like, that is never, hopefully that's never been anybody's motivation, right? I mean, that certainly isn't going to inspire them to jump out of bed and really attack the day and have a great time of it. And so I'm always baffled by people who take that kind of micromanaging approach instead of, hey, this is your domain. Yes, I need things from you periodically, updates, and when on big decisions we talk, which I think those are such great guidelines. I think anybody kind of coming up through IT, when I was in the Army, when you learn leadership by having a bunch of bad leaders, mediocre leaders, and good leaders, and you kind of take from the good and even learning from the bad, like, oh, that's bad, I'm not going to be like that and so that is kind of the Army's way of training leadership. I mean, honestly, it's just kind of one of these things where until you go to sort of different leadership trainees, right, and schools in the Army, it is kind of that hands-on. And that advice has been passed down, I think, for centuries now in the Army. And I think that as they get leaders like you, where they see that, hey, wait, we get to, this is my area. I mean, people love that. You get to have that sort of, control over your team, and now you're empowered to make it succeed. And that's why people love going to work, not because they're gonna, they're little robots that are gonna do X, Y, and Z. And that's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I found, so just a little bit of career advice for what it's worth, is that I've found, if you focus on self obsolescence, meaning you empower the folks on your team, you give them more responsibility and you delegate them so they can learn essentially to have your role. At the end of the day, it allows you the opportunity to focus on other areas and other things. And I would attribute the vast majority of the growth in my career to that approach, because I can then, go to my boss and ask for more responsibility and potential, and that generally leads to a greater span of control, which generally leads to another position, and just continues to go through that. And so I think it's the best thing you can do for the folks on your team. But in my mind, it's the opposite of job security by, being controlling. It's really, it helps you grow your career, and it helps you expand what you learn and what you're able to do. And then if you move on, then you've got somebody or somebodies that can easily step into your role because they've already been doing at least part of it, right? And you've built a culture on the team that, the other folks will be engaged and will be supportive. And so you've already built this culture that is going to help ensure success in that space. So I think, I think that's really critical. And we all know managers who are controlling and micromanaging. And and to your point, it's not encouraging. It's not an enjoyable situation. So if you really want the best out of your team, you have to let them, drive it and be engaged and really want to be part of what's happening on your team and in the organization.
Well, I can't help but think that as we talk about getting the most out of your team and your organization, obviously everybody is looking currently at how do we use AI to get the most out of, to enhance productivity, to help people be better, do better, the whole nine yards. And so I of course I'm gonna throw that question to you. In you guys have, in the financial services industry, you guys have gone through, there's been a lot of it. That's an interesting one. I mean, because there's been a lot of change, with in terms of technology and how you implement it. And I think everybody loves it when their bank starts doing, some cool new tech thing. At least the inner geek in me gets very happy when there's a cool new a feature from the bank. But I gotta ask, when it comes to AI, is that something that you guys are looking at? What are your thoughts on its role in banking? What's your thoughts on its role in? We could go on and on, but your thoughts on AI and kind of your approach to it. What are you doing with that? What are your thoughts?
I think in pretty much every industry, with all of the hype that was generated when ChatGPT came out, there was certainly an interest. I think most organizations did a deep dive of sorts to at least get familiar with it, to try and understand it, whether that was internally or whether that was partnering with a third party. And what seems to have happened is that there was this extraordinary hype cycle, but when push came to shove, it was less actually useful in production than people thought, and for various reasons. Part of it was you didn't get expected results, or there were inaccuracies, or there was risk associated with ingesting data. So there were a number of considerations that weren't obvious in the beginning of the release of that technology. And another thing that I find really, really interesting is I just saw an article. I think it was Citibank. It was one of the larger organizations, and this article was 500 AI use cases rolled out into production. And my assumption, and I think most people's assumption, just because of how the article was framed, is that this was since ChatGPT, since Gen AI really came to the forefront. Well, you read the article, and they had been working on this for 10 or 15 years. So they had 500 use cases in place, but it was, machine learning, it was various flavors of AI. And so as I started to look at it, and after we talked about technology folks loving technology, I took a few folks on my team and just let them loose. It's just like, here's a sandbox, go play. And the benefit of that was they got to learn, how it worked to a certain extent, but also some of the limitations, some of the capabilities. And then we did some small scale POCs, and that were successful. We built a job description generator. So we needed to dip our toes in to understand what it was that we were dealing with. But at the end of the day, where, my philosophy, the way I'm looking at it now, is that it really is another tool in the toolbox. And you still have organizational strategy, you still have organizational goals, you still have technology strategy and technology goals. And AI is another tool in the toolbox. And sometimes it's the right tool and sometimes it's not the right tool. And if you're looking for, especially in a regulated industry like banking, if you're looking for back office efficiency, there's a lot of opportunity there. But I was giving a talk last week, and one of my themes was about AI, and one of the themes was, don't waste a good hype cycle, because even though Gen AI may not be the right solution, but machine learning might be, and I think machine learning is probably the right solution in 70% of the AI cases that get presented, because you use it for predictive analytics, and there's just a whole slew of use cases in that space. But use this hype cycle to implement the technologies that you need to implement anyway. Build out data governance, get your data quality in order. So then you can start taking advantage of some of the other AI capabilities that are there. And we're looking at some things that Gen AI, or the natural language processing and the tokenization part of Gen AI, really brought to the forefront, which is, taking all of our data, say our policies and procedures, and making them natural language searchable. And we're starting to get into some RAG capabilities along the same line, so we can, so we can just make it easier to find information. Same thing with all of our, loan documents, to be able to readily and easily search those. Hey, I think we had a loan like this a couple of years ago. A natural language query will bring that up, and you can see that, as opposed to, searching for hours or days or never finding it. So there are definitely some really strong capabilities that are there, but you still need to apply, here's my goal, here's my strategy, here's my roadmap, what tools are right for the job. And again, sometimes that's AI or a flavor of AI, and sometimes it's not.
I love that. Never waste a good hype cycle. That is fantastic. And I think you're spot on. It is a tool like any other. It isn't, and I think it was easy for people to kind of, I don't want to say conflate it with the internet, but that comparison where they're trying to understand how big and how, the size, of what AI could be. Okay, it's easy to remember. Oh, okay, the internet changed everything. AI is going to change everything. Yes, in time, for sure, it will. But the actionable now of it is, right now, it's able to be a tool in certain ways, and various tools, right? It's a tool, and how do we use this tool, this particular tool, and making the right tools. And I think the fun part about it is it's, helpful in deciding what that tool can be, and helping you kind of direct you and guide you in those ways. So I think that's such great advice, is to remember that at the end of the day, it's a tool. It is not a panacea for all your IT woes or your operational, needs. It is just a tool. So I think that's brilliant. Really well said.
Right. And you need to be careful of the companies that say that it is a panacea, especially third-party consulting companies who are still trying to ride that hype cycle. And then the other thing that you need to pay attention to is when vendors are now suddenly selling AI, My favorite current example is Salesforce. So they have their new Agent Force, which is really their customer care bots rebranded with a agent builder that sits on top of it. Now, the agent builder is very cool, don't get me wrong, but the underlying AI technology has been around for at least 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. Brad, this has been so much fun. I think we could go on for hours and hours. But before we wrap up, can you tell everybody where they can find out more about you and where they can find out more about HTLF?
Sure. My LinkedIn profile contains everything about me. It's under Bradley Enneking. So I think you can find that pretty easily. If you want to contact me, have any questions about anything we talked about, happy to engage in a conversation and respond to that. HTLF Bank is htlf.com. And that's, again, everything about HTLF Bank is there. And Matthew, I really appreciate this. This was a great conversation. So thanks for having me on.
It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks, Brad.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Cyber Business Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.